We are delighted to have with us Aditya, Outreach Coordinator at Animal Ethics. He's currently pursuing a doctorate in philosophy and logic at the University of Santiago, Spain, with a focus on emerging issues in animal ethics from a long-termist perspective. Maybe Aditya, you might want to expand on that later, maybe during your conversation. Aditya has previously collaborated with various animal organizations worldwide, and I think you recently had a webinar with Save Animal, right? And yeah, he's been actively advocating for animals since the year 2015. So thank you, Aditya, for joining us today. Um, uh, Please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Namika, and hello, everyone. So nice to see all of you joining this session. Um, yeah, and taking your time out from your busy days to attend this session. Um, yeah, like Anamika mentioned, I am Aditya, the outreach coordinator at Animal Ethics. I also do fundraising for them. I also work with Electric Sheep on their fellowship on AI and animals. And as Anamika mentioned, I'm also currently pursuing my PhD in uh, uh, philosophy and logic from University of Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Um, I do recognize that we are not too many people today, so I would like to keep our discussion more interactive and more as a discussion. So I also do recognize that some of you might have seen some of the things that I'm talking already. So I will try to go a little bit more into details of this topic. Um, yeah, so that's how I intend to keep this session. And feel free to share thoughts or ideas or questions at any point in the chat. I'd be happy to engage with them. So yeah, that's mostly about it. There's a lot of static and echo. Is this the case with others as well, or can you hear me well?
Nothing at my end. I mean, it's
Uh,
clear.
do others hear me well, or is there a static or an echo?
Anybody?
The audio is quite clear on my side. I don't have any issue.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ishvi.
Great. So it seems like Pujita, there might be some issue with your speaker. Um, Great. So the topic for today's session is why wild animal advocacy must be on India's animal advocacy agenda. Um, but before I go on to introducing the topic and the different considerations associated with it, I would like to request if you could take a minute out to basically scan this QR code. I have also shared the link in the chat. Essentially, this is to understand what is your current existing knowledge about wild animal welfare. And then I could build upon that. And then after the talk, we fill in a final survey to see if there were any changes in your ideas about wild animal welfare. So yeah, if you could please take a moment to quickly fill it in and maybe react with a thumbs up once you're done, and then I'll move forward. Great. So related to today's topic, I will briefly introduce animal ethics. Again, I'm not sure if I really need to go into the details here, assuming that most of you are already familiar with it. I'll talk a little bit about developments in research about the sentience of non-human animals. And then I'll pivot to talking about the situation of animals in the wild, which is the crux of today's talk. And then I will also briefly touch upon how it's relevant to India and what we can do about it given our socio-economic factors. So yeah, that's the broad structure of today's talk. I would also like to encourage, given that we have a small group today, I would love for you to be more interactive and like share ideas and thoughts. That would be nice for me as well. So to start off with, I'm pretty sure most of you must be aware about what speciesism is, which is a form of discrimination based on the species membership of an individual, which is unjustified, similar to most other forms of prejudices and discriminations in today's society, which is either racism, sexism, casteism, classism, etc., where we discriminate against individuals based on unjustified criteria. So there might be a form of discrimination that's based on justified criteria. We always discriminate between good and bad, etc., between which form of service we want to take, etc. But we do that based on justified factors. But when we talk about speciesism or any form of prejudice, discrimination against individuals, usually it's on the basis of unjustified factors, which is species membership is not a justified factor for treating someone less well than others or treating someone worse off than others. And now when I talk about speciesism, there's different forms of speciesism. Most people are aware about the popular form of speciesism, which is anthropocentrism, which is the the most dominant form of speciesism, which is where the interests of humans count for more than equally strong interests of other non-human animals. So they both might have an interest in not suffering and dying. But when there is a conflict, we end up giving much more weight to the interests of humans over non-human animals, even if their interest is similar. In fact, we are much more biased. For example, there's a trivial pleasure for a human for 5 minutes, whether it's for culinary pleasure, for cosmetics, etc. We give that much more weight than the interest of an animal's life, where she goes through an experience of torment and suffering for the entire duration of her lifetime. But not going deep into that, there's also other forms of speciesism. I'm pretty sure some of you must already be familiar with this thought experiment, but I would like for all of you to imagine an animal in the wild. Uh, what is her age? What is she doing? Which species is she from? So just I would like you to think about this animal and then we'll come to it at a later point. There's also other forms of speciesism apart from anthropocentrism, which could be for aesthetic reasons, like cute animals like pandas or dogs or cats, as compared to animals that are considered non-aesthetic, like rats or frogs or bats. Also, animals that are conservationally more valuable or scientifically more interesting are given more consideration. For example, the keystone species like lions and tigers, or some endangered species are treated much more, are given much more weight for their interests as compared to animals that are not considered scientifically valuable, like, say, for example, the vermin species like crows and uh, rats and wild boars, etc. And the third form of speciesism, or the fourth form, sorry, is also based on size. For example, because the larger animals are easier to empathize with, they are easier to relate with, uh, they have more uh, displayed emotions that we can relate with. We tend to give their interests much more weight than the animals that are smaller in size. Um, Now, when I asked you about which an animal to imagine, I'd be very surprised if you thought of an insect or an invertebrate. But if you look at the proportion of animals that are invertebrates, 99% of them are invertebrates or insects, 99.99%. It's a very small proportion of them that are mammals and larger animals. Most of them are smaller animals. And so we humans in general tend to treat animals that are smaller worse off than animals that are larger. So yeah, these were some forms of speciesism. And of course, when I try to challenge people, oh, it's wrong to be speciesist. they usually have some common defenses in favor of anthropocentrism. The first is that, oh, well, humans have this complex intellectual capacities. We have like this increased cognition and sophisticated thinking capacity that non-human animals lack. So it's fine for me to treat them worse off. Or two, they argue in favor of relationship that, oh, I share this very special relationship with other humans or some species, and I don't share it with other non-human animals, so I can basically ignore their interests. And the third is the argument from might and dominance, which is that humans are more powerful, we just more mighty than them, and so we can treat animals that are less powerful in ways where we can harm them. Um, and to rebut this, we can look at one argument, which is to rebut these arguments. It's called as the argument from species overlap. So the usual conception of humans and non-humans is that humans fall on this side of the line, and then there is this line that's separating us from all the other non-human animals, which are not powerful, not smart, and we don't have a special relationship with them. However, if you look at even us as among the human species, there are humans who are not powerful, like for example, babies, or there are humans who are not as cognitively gifted, for example, people who are mentally challenged. And there are people who we don't share a special relationship with, for example, orphans or people who stay in faraway lands, like in other countries, in war, etc. Yeah, sure, Pujita. And we don't treat these humans that are less powerful or not as smart in ways that we treat non-human animals. For example, putting them in battery cages or hurting them, etc. In fact, we give extra consideration to these humans who are less gifted because we want to, protect them. We extend honorary consideration to them to ensure that their interests are protected. So following the same logic, if we if we are against accepting the conclusion that it's okay to treat humans who lack these special capacities in harmful ways, the only way to do that is by uh, erasing the line and accepting uh, the conclusion that it is not justified to treat non-human animals in ways where we ignore their interest just because they lack the the capacities that we mentioned earlier, which is power, might, and smartness and special relationships. So, what is it that matters here? The thing that matters, of course, as most of us know, is sentience. For those of you who don't know, sentience is the capacity to have positive and negative experiences. This is different from consciousness. Consciousness is the capacity to have subjective experience, whereas sentience is commonly used to refer to valenced experience, which is either feeling positive or negative experiences like suffering. Um, but how do we know that non-human animals are sentient? Well, one could look at two indicators of sentience. One could be the physiology, which is the biological factors that allow them to be conscious. For example, humans, we know that in the absence of a centralized nervous system, we would not have conscious experiences. You could remove our hand, you could remove our leg, but we would still have cognitive processing, conscious experiences. But if you remove our brain, we end up not having conscious experiences. So this gives us a reason to assume that it's the centralized nervous system that allows us to process these signals that happen at different parts of the body and centralize it in a brain. It's called encephalization. And then we are not unique in possessing them. Many other mammals also have centralized nervous system, like cows, even birds. Until 1970s, birds were considered not to be sentient by many scientific thinkers because they lacked the prefrontal cortex. But later it was discovered that they don't need a prefrontal cortex to be sentient. They have other mechanisms through which they can have conscious experiences. And so it was uh, they came to the conclusion that a centralized nervous system is sufficient and they don't necessarily need prefrontal cortex to have conscious experience. And there are other animals. like crabs or crustaceans, they don't necessarily have a nervous system, but they have something called a ganglia, which performs similar functions to that of a centralized nervous system. And it collects the signals from different parts of the body and centralizes it in this part that you see here. And many insects also possess a centralized nervous system. For example, a honeybee also has a centralized nervous system, and it has a lot of neurons that allows it to have conscious experience. And the next thing that one could look at is the behavior. Like intuitively, I would look at the behavior of an animal or a human to understand that they are sentient and they have experiences which include pleasure and suffering. We do know that animals display very complex emotions. For example, uh, elephants show complex emotions like grief and mourning over their dead ones. They show care for their young offsprings. There's emotions of love and care that's displayed among many mammals. And also, sorry, there is this other uh, experiment that's done to determine if an animal is self-aware. It's called as the mirror test, where they put a small dot on the body of an animal and or a human, and they look at themselves in the mirror, and they try to test if the animal is able to identify that the dot is on its own body and is able to identify that. And so even fishes, for example, like this zebrafish or cleaner have passed the mirror test, where initially when the dot was put on their body, they would feel very aggressive. They would look at the reflection and think that this fish is another fish, and they would display aggressive behavior. But then later on, when they try exploring and they try swimming upside down, and they realize that, oh, it's the same fish. It's me in the mirror. It's the reflection. And then they notice this dot on their body, and they are able to locate where the dot is, and they try to rub it off in the sand, basically, because they have this tendency to be very hygienic and clean. Um, so yeah, so essentially, even fishes and aquatic animals have passed the mirror test, which shows that they have this self-awareness and identification of themselves as another, like, as a distinct individual. And also, there's been other complex behaviors even in insects. Honeybees have this uh, behavior called as the waggle dance, where where they communicate with the rest of the hive on the distance of the food source and the direction of the food source by rotating a certain number of times in a certain direction to communicate where the food source is. And there's also been evidence of play behavior where they roll food, like food or substances, into small balls, and they just play around with it. And this would not happen if they were robots. They would only do this if they do have some subjective experience of joy or pain when they have to escape from something. And there's like ongoing research and like a lot of research coming up and showing that, animals do have very complex behavior, which is an indicator of their sentience. For example, snakes, they don't have good visuals. So instead of the visual mirror test, they have a smell mirror test where they have been able to show that, they've been able to see that snakes recognize themselves as a separate individual. Uh, and also, like I mentioned, bees have play behavior. Crabs display flexible decision making. When there's two shells, they choose the shells that there's. If they go for one shell, they receive a painful electric shock, and when they go to another one, they don't. And so they make these decisions on which shell to go to based on how harmful it is for them. And fruit flies as well. I don't know if you know what fruit flies are. They are like these small flies that come near fruits, or like when there's like a thread hanging around, they come like in a group and create a nest there. So there's also been evidence of fruit flies displaying dynamic sleep patterns and also like extremely complex behavior like PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, which was only thought to exist in very few species. And even fruit flies have shown examples of them going through that experience. Um, Yeah, and many more. There's like, if you look at the field of ethology, which is the field of studying uh, animal minds, there's a lot of research coming up that shows how complex emotions and behaviors that animals display. And that's one thing to also keep in mind. Now, when I talk about this with all of you, and I assume most of you are already animal advocates, you must be like, oh, this is obvious. Animals do have sentience, they do experience pain. But you would be surprised to know that most of the scientific community, like until very recently, was very resistant to even accepting the fact that animals are conscious. They would argue that, oh, animals are robots and don't have conscious experience, or they behave like automata, like robots, basically. So this is very important to even talk about the fact that animals are sentient. And there has been growing scientific consensus on this. For example, there's a Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness where more than 100 prominent international scientists came together to sign the declaration that humans are not unique in possessing the neural substrates, neurobiological substrates that allow for conscious experience, and that many animals also possess the same. Similarly, more recently, there was the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness, where again, a lot of prominent academics and scientists signed the declaration that there is a strong scientific support for conscious experience among mammals and birds. And there's a realistic possibility in all vertebrates and many invertebrates. And whenever there's a realistic possibility of conscious experience, even if we don't know for sure that they are conscious, it is irresponsible to ignore how these animals are affected by our actions and decisions. So essentially, this is called as a precautionary principle. Even if you don't know for sure that this animal is sentient, but there is a realistic possibility of them being sentient, then we should be careful and cautious and act in ways where we don't actively harm them. Um, Cool. And just touching a bit about, like, we've talked about speciesism, arguments for and against speciesism. We've talked about sentience. We've talked about indicators of sentience, how there's evidence now to to give us a reason to assume that most animals are sentient, and even many invertebrates. All vertebrates and many invertebrates. And now let's briefly touch upon how this relates to us in India. What has Indian history of animal ethics been? Fortunately, it's been quite rich. India has been a key player in animal protection with a rich history of uh, principles and legislation to extend consideration and protection to animals. We've had like uh, since long ago in history, whether it's kings, or like we go back to pre-colonial times as well. We've been displaying a rich history of concern for animals. From the time of Ashoka, where he mandated banning animal sacrifice and also mandated uh, veterinary medical services for animals and people putting food and water for animals. Uh, and infirmaries for animals as well, and also to some indigenous religions from India, like Jains and Sikhs. There's always been a central tenet of uh, protecting animals and recognizing that they do go through suffering and that it's wrong to, put them through cruelty like ahimsa or anicca. And there's been many indigenous tribes as well. For example, the Drokpa tribe, the from the Nepals that have been like predominantly plant-based, the Bishnoi tribe in Rajasthan, who usually adopt orphaned animals like deers and try to even breastfeed them to ensure that they survive. They give them food, etc. There's the Araku tribe. There's many more tribes, basically. Even in Tamil Nadu, for example, the constitution of Tamil Nadu mandates for all wild animals to have a right to water and water bodies. So we've been very progressive, principally. Um, and also in terms of legal protection for animals, you might think that given that India has very poor execution of laws, we are probably lagging. But at least in principle and in theory, we do have quite progressive laws when you compare India to other countries. The only countries that are doing much better are, say, for example, countries in Latin America and the UK, but India is still up there in terms of extending legal protection for animals. For example, in the Jallikattu case, they talked about speciesism and sentience of animals. So the judiciary and the parliament has been forthcoming in extending moral consideration to animals and protection as well. However, we are lagging behind on several fronts, but that's not to say that relatively we have been doing quite well in terms of protecting animals. Um, And also, there's high rates of vegetarianism in the country, probably one of the highest. Again, it's important to note here that this is not necessarily from concern for animals, but this could also be due to religious and caste factors that people follow a plant-based diet. Not necessarily plant-based, but a vegetarian diet, like a lacto-ovo vegetarian diet. But still the fact that there is a culture that's assimilated to not consuming meat or flesh of animals uh, is also very important. Oh, I just noticed that my screen was not sharing. Sorry about that. um, do you see my screen now? I'm surprised no one mentioned it initially. Thank you, Tushti. Um, Great. Okay. So I've been talking without slides all along, but yeah, here you go.
I noticed it, but I thought you wanted to keep it like that, like
No,
just.
no, like I mentioned, I had slides and I wanted to talk about it. Um, but quickly, just showing you some of the slides that I had.
I also thought about it, but can we get the previous slides to
Yes,
our
I'm
emails? Because I want to refer to these slides and study further.
sure, sure. I'd be happy to do that. Um, cool. Yeah, so we had the structure, and I spoke about what speciesism is. I don't think you missed out on much, but essentially the different forms of speciesism, anthropocentrism, and the different forms of speciesism that I mentioned, and also the arguments that people use to defend anthropocentrism and the argument from species overlap, uh, which is what I mentioned, where there's this line, and that line is not justified if we scrutinize the arguments that they mention. Then I talked about sentience and the capacity to have positive and negative experiences, the indicators, the centralized nervous system among most non-human animals, and then also the behavior, which is complex emotions, the mirror test, which I mentioned. Um, yeah, and also the different declarations that exist. And now I briefly covered the relevance to India and how we have a rich history of uh, concern for animals. But that said, that there's also an increase in factory farming within India. For example, a few decades ago, we didn't have factory farming of fishes. But now, like if you look, there's some towns that are dedicated to aquatic animal farming, like in Andhra Pradesh and some parts of West Bengal. There's a huge growth in factory farming of many animals. Um, That said, most of us are aware that due to a lack of, like, due to these speciesist attitudes, we as humans do end up harming animals. Uh, I will focus on wild animals because I will not go into the details on how humans harm farmed animals because I'm assuming most of you are already aware of how we put animals through factory farming. Um, but for example, humans harm animals for many reasons, animals in the wild. It could be for entertainment or it could be for human animal conflict. In India and in other parts of the world, humans kill millions of animals in the wild every year for these reasons. Um, it could be for trophy hunting because an animal is considered a vermin, or it could be because an animal is just like destroying the crops, etc. Um, yeah, and another example is how humans treat rats, for example, because they're an inconvenience to the households, etc. They kill them in quite harmful ways, actually, and putting them in glue traps and giving them very harmful chemicals, which causes excruciating pain before they end up dying. Um, and also, if you look at some animals that were introduced into the wild by humans. For example, these rabbits were introduced into Australia for the purposes of hunting, and then their population spread, and now the humans wanted to control it, and so they gave them disease deliberately. This is called as myxotomasis, which is a very painful condition, and they go through a lot of pain and suffering for 12 days before they end up dying. And so, yeah, humans also do end up deliberately inflicting harms on animals. But that said, most of us, when we think about wild animal suffering, we think about what harms humans cause to animals. But most of the harms that animals in the wild undergo is not human caused, but natural harms. Um, so, for example, the natural documentaries, which exist, the nature documentaries in National Geography or Discovery Channel, they show animals living a beautiful life in the wild if humans don't interfere. But animals in the wild constantly suffer from natural conditions, whether it's extreme weather events like cold or due to extreme heat, there's a drought, and animals usually go through extreme pain before dying. And sometimes when these droughts, the water bodies end up drying, and all the aquatic animals that depend on water to survive, they end up dying as well. And there's also natural disasters, like for example, in Kaziranga National Park, there's floods every single year, and a lot of animals end up dying. And in the surveys that exist of the animal mortality there, they don't include the smaller animals. They only usually include the larger animals. So a lot of smaller animals are affected during these natural disasters, like volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, etc. And animals in the wild don't only exist in the wilderness areas. There's also urban wild animals like birds, squirrels, rats, peacocks, etc., snakes. And they are also affected by uh, human factors as well. Like, for example, they collide with the buildings, etc. Um, and animals also have a tendency to engage in conflicts, whether it's for territory or mates. They very frequently engage in fights with each other, and the dominant one ends up hurting the other one, and usually both of them are injured. And animals in the wild don't have access to medical care, and so their injuries are quite severe, and they get infected, and is quite painful and causes a lot of suffering. And one reason why it is reasonable to assume that there's a lot of suffering in the wild is because of the dominant reproductive strategy. What do I mean when I say reproductive strategy? So there's two different reproductive strategies. One, where animals give birth to fewer offsprings and they give a lot of parental care. For example, humans, orangutans, elephants, they give birth to one or two offsprings and they ensure that a lot of care is given to these babies so they grow up to adulthood. But there are these other groups of animals that give birth to huge number of offsprings, out of which very few end up surviving. For example, turtles, they give birth to 600 offsprings, but in a clutch, and out of which very few end up surviving to adulthood. And most of them end up dying when they are young from parasitism, from predation, from diseases, sometimes getting disoriented as well. Another example is of a bullfrog. They give birth to, on average, around 10,000 offsprings in a single time, out of which less than 1% end up surviving to adulthood. And sometimes when the water dries up, all these tadpoles, assuming that they are sentient, end up dying. So most animals that come into
I have a
existence, they
question.
lead a very short life.
I have a question that these any animals, do they reproduce in large numbers intentionally, or is it just by their reproductive system that they do this? Because, for example, humans or orangutans cannot make a lot of offsprings, but these
Mhm.
animals can. So, is it really a strategy, or is it something that happens naturally?
Yeah, right. Thank you for the question, Ishmeen. So when I say reproductive strategy, I don't mean intentionally. It's like naturally. They have evolved. So either there's two ways. So what does nature or evolution care about? About genetic propagation, that the genes are propagated from one progeny to the other, etc. So either the species gives a lot of parental care so that this individual grows and then promotes the gene to the next generation, or there's these other species that give birth to huge offsprings naturally. It's not like they're doing evolutionary, they're biologically giving birth to huge number of offsprings, and at least some of them survive to adulthood so that they take them ahead. So this is called as R selected species colloquially, and this is called as K selected species, where they give birth to fewer number of offsprings. Similarly, butterflies as well, they give birth to around 600 offsprings, out of which it's estimated that less than 10% end up surviving to adulthood. So most of the species that come into existence, they lead a very short life. They don't have a lot of opportunity to have positive experiences, and they end up dying very young. So most animals that come into existence in the wild, they lead a short life and they die pretty young, which means that there's reason to assume that there's a lot of suffering out there in the wild. Now, when I talk about this, people are like, but Aditya, nature is very complex. What can we even do about it? Can we even like go out there in the wild and help animals? People wouldn't want to help animals in the wild. But there are examples of people actually helping animals in the wild. For example, there's rehabilitation centers and rescue centers for animals in the wild where people come up with hospitals and infirmaries to treat whenever an animal is orphaned or injured in the wild. Similarly, like I mentioned, the Bishnoi community, when animals are orphaned, humans usually rescue these orphaned animals and try to help them. And I also mentioned famine and drought. So during extreme weather conditions, there might be lack of food, but there have been large-scale feeding programs to feed these animals as well. Also during natural disasters, for example,
So
forest
I
fires
have a
or
question.
floods. Yeah.
I have a question. In the past slide, which city are they talking about specifically, where they have
Uh,
helped in droughts?
oh, there are many cities, many states where animals in the wild have helped. This is particularly from Rajasthan.
Okay.
You
Thank
can
you so
talk.
much.
You can talk about mass feeding programs in Rajasthan. I think you can write it down in the chat, and I will just I will answer it at the end of the session, just because I noticed that there's less time remaining. But yeah, thanks for the questions. Um, Yeah, and similarly, even for aquatic animals during tides, they get disoriented and get stuck on the shore. And sometimes the communities come together to take these whales or dolphins back into the water as well. They're not like, oh, this is a natural source of harm, so we will not help them. But they, in fact, come and they show compassion and kindness to these animals and try to help them back. But that said, I do recognize that there are uncertainties. So, for example, one might argue that, oh, there's a lot of complicated relationships among animals in the nature, and if we try to help one, it might harm the other. So we should always be cognizant of that. And whenever there's uncertainties in trying to help someone, what we end up doing is we end up doing more research. We try to gather more information before we actually implement an intervention. So, for the same reason, what we advocate to helping animals in the wild is promoting the field of welfare biology or the science of wild animal welfare, which is a cross-disciplinary field where we gather information from ecology, zoology, natural science, etc. And we combine this information to understand what is the life of an animal in the wild like. How sentient are they, and what experiences do they have, and what harms do they undergo, and how can we responsibly help them? Responsibly is an important word because we are not just saying go out there and start helping. We are saying how do we responsibly help them to ensure that they have a positive well-being. And there's some other examples of this as well. For example, I mentioned the floods in Kaziranga National Park. The government of Assam has built these artificial highlands to help the larger animals, but a lot of other smaller animals are being helped as well, where they escape the flood water and rest on these highlands. Similarly, when people feed pigeons, they're worried about their population increasing. So Barcelona is actually experimenting with contraceptions for pigeons so that they can control the population without killing them. Um, Similarly, for other animals as well, they usually some humans or some societies engage in hunting to control the population, but there's a more humane and compassionate way to control the population without harming them. For example, contraceptives and fertility control. I also mentioned diseases in the wild, but there's also research being done to vaccinate animals in the wild against harmful diseases like rabies, tuberculosis, and brucellosis. While this is done for human benefit, it also ends up benefiting the animals as well. They put these vaccines in these cookies and drop them from helicopters in large parts of Europe and North America, and now large parts of these areas are now free from rabies. What else can be done if you're interested in this? I would highly recommend you first educate yourself about the topic of wild animal suffering, because a lot of people confuse wild animal suffering with biodiversity protection or conservation. and stuff. But wild animal suffering and welfare is a different topic compared to these. Sometimes they overlap and sometimes they don't. So you could check out our website, this topic of wild animal suffering, and you will find a lot of information there. I myself was not aware of a lot of this information before I read this website, so I would highly recommend that. There's 4 organizations right now, actually 5, working on this issue. There's Wild Animal Initiative that works on research on wild animal welfare. There's Animal Ethics that does outreach. Rethink Priorities also does research. And New York University Wild Animal Welfare Program does both policy and research work. And there's a new organization called Center for Wild Animal Welfare as well that works on wild animal welfare policy. So there's very few organizations that are solely focused on wild animal welfare. And also, this is a very neglected field. If you look at the funding that goes into companion animals and farmed animals, wild animal welfare receives very little funding. And some people feel that, oh, maybe scientists might not be interested in doing research on this. But we did a survey of scholars and students in life sciences and in multiple countries, not just in a single country. Um, yeah, this is scholars and students, and we found that they are in favor of helping wild animals. So these are the 3 areas that they are interested in: vaccinating animals in the wild, helping urban wild animals, and helping animals affected by weather events. Maybe because they believe that weather events is partly caused by climate change, so we have some duty to help animals in the wild. So our goal should be to get this conversation about wild animal welfare out there, even if the intervention is not very high impact. We try to get the conversation in some way or the other. And we have released the wild animal suffering video course because we know that there's like almost 100 million Hindi speakers and are not very comfortable necessarily with English. So we've released all of this information in Hindi. You can find it on our website, on our YouTube channel, sorry. Uh, if you just type animal ethics, you will notice a playlist which covers all these topics, all the different sources of suffering of wild animals in much more detail. Uh, we also have this in English in case you prefer that. And if you prefer to read about this in much more detail, if you go on our website in the download section, you can find an introduction guide about this topic. And we have also recently released a documentary called Sea Antillions, which is about the scent of aquatic animals, which is very, very interesting. You can find it on our website, on our YouTube channel as well. Just type Sea Antillions in YouTube and you should find it. It's quite interesting and it's only 26 minutes. And finally, if you're interested in supporting us or being involved with us, please sign up to a newsletter. I know that most of you have already done that in the form where you registered for this webinar. But you're very welcome to join and stay in touch with us. That's mostly about it. Thank you very much for your time. One final thing is I would like to request you to again scan this QR code or to fill in the final survey. I can also share the link of the survey in the chat. If you have any questions, I would request you to please type it down in the chat or unmute and ask. I will start off with like answering the questions in the chat first, and I've also shared the final survey. I would highly appreciate it if you could please fill in the survey, so it helps us understand how has your idea about wild animal suffering changed. Quickly taking in the questions. So Akash has asked, what is the difference between speciesism and consciousness? Are oysters sentient? So speciesism is the discrimination against two species, जो भेदभाव बोलते हैं, like treating one better than the other. Whereas consciousness refers to the capacity to have subjective experience. When you see the color red, you feel that it is something. You're not like a robot. It's not like you're not experiencing anything. But when you see something or when you touch something, you experience it. This experience is called as consciousness. And speciesism is a bias, is a prejudice, is a form of discrimination like racism or sexism. And regarding your next question about oysters being sentient, there is uncertainty about that. People are not very sure, but oysters do display some behavior. Like, for example, they go towards sunlight or they move from one location to the other, and they also have very decentralized form of neurons in their physiological structure. If you're interested in more about this, you can just go to our animal ethics website and type illustrated uh, representation of sentience in invertebrates, and you will find some discussion about oysters there. So they do show like some indicators of behavior and uh, the physiological necessity, but it's not very sure that they are sentient. But as I mentioned, even if you're not sure, we do extend precautionary consideration for them and avoid harming them. Um,
I actually wanted to just, sorry to interrupt. It's just that
mhm.
I did not mean to write speciesism. I wanted to
Yeah,
write sentience versus consciousness. What is the difference
yeah.
between sentience and consciousness?
Thanks for clarifying. So when I say sentience, as I mentioned, it's about positive and negative experiences, whereas one can be conscious without having balanced experience. So balance is like either joy or suffering, whereas consciousness could just be just experiencing things without necessarily going through suffering or joy. Thanks for clarifying. And moving on to the next question. Ishmeen says, I think drought and other disasters also happen due to climate change, which is caused by humans. You're right. Right now, humans have affected climate to such an extent that we probably have some responsibility for the climate. But the point is that it is still natural to some degree. And even without humans, there would still be droughts and disasters happening. Um, yeah. And your saintly devil says, I recently watched Sentience. It was very informative. Thank you very much. If you could share it among your network and let more people appreciate the sentience of aquatic animals and extend consideration to them, I think that would be great. Ishmeen says, as an economic student, how can I contribute to welfare biology? And which are the organizations that I can join? Great question. Um, so I just have to note here that I will have to head soon because I have another meeting, but then I'll quickly answer this. Um, I think, like, for example, there is this organization called Global Priorities Institute. They use welfare economics. Uh, sorry, it's called, yeah, welfare economics principles to create something similar for animals in the wild, welfare biology as well. So you can take a look at the paper by Yu Kwang NG. He was the first person to write a paper on uh, welfare biology, and he was coming from a background of economics as well. You could also look at how does economics affect wild animals? How does mainstream economic principles affect wild animals and stuff like that? If you're interested in more discussion about this, I would be very happy to discuss with you one-on-one. You can send me an email. I'll just share my email in the chat for anyone who's interested in getting more advice about this. Um, and which are the other organizations that I joined? Like I mentioned, Animal Ethics, Wild Animal Initiative, Rethink Priorities, New York University, Wild Animal Welfare Program, and Center for Wild Animal Welfare are the organizations that are primarily focused on this. Uh, but again, if you're interested in particular forms of volunteering or helping them, I would recommend you reach out to me so I can help. And yes, definitely you can make a career in this. This is a very new field. It's only been in existence for 5 or 6 years now. And there's definitely scope to advance your career in this. Like I was a normal animal advocate talking about farmed animals, but then I found out animal ethics. I volunteered with them, and then I started working on spreading concern about wild animal suffering by working on them, working with them. Um, Again, if you're interested in this, please reach out to me or reach out to us at Animal Ethics. We would be very happy to talk with you about how you could contribute. Any other questions? If not, I would be very happy to wrap up this session.
Yeah,
After you, Anamika.
yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Aditya. That was a great discussion. And thank you for initiating these crucial conversations on wild animal suffering. And even with this limited number of participants, I think today's session is just the beginning, and we hope that it sparks deeper engagement and collaboration within India's animal protection community, who are primarily dogs and cats and, other farmed animals. And my personal takeaway is that, like, the responsibility towards animals doesn't end at the city's edge. It has to extend to every forest, every river, and the sky that we share. So that said, thank you so much, Aditya and Animal Ethics team, for partnering with FIAPO and for taking out time. And thank you, everyone. Uh, Ishmi, Akash, I think I can thank everyone by their names.
Yep.
Drishti, Pujita, Raka, Sinha, and Minakshi. Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
Aditya.
Have a great day. Bye.